Hello and welcome to a special edition of Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. We're here in a rather blustery Brussels where the weather really does match the political mood. The establishment has been dealt a bloody nose by the far right, and they say this is just the beginning. This has been a seismic week for European politics. After those election results, what now for EU policy and the people who shape it? Well, let's bring in our guests. Geert Laporte is former director of the European Think Tanks Group and a specialist in European Union foreign policy. Yusuf Erim is TRT World's Editor-at-Large. And Beatriz Rios is a Spanish freelance journalist specialising in European current affairs. Geert, I'll come to you first of all. Just tell me, has there been a sense of shock amongst EU officials this week?
I don't think so. I think that the polls were to a large extent correct. We knew that this was going to happen. We knew that the extreme right would gain significantly more votes and more seats in the parliament. And I think there is definitely a result that was to some extent expected. Whether it's a good result for Europe and for Europe in the world, for Europe as a geopolitical player, is of course a different question. I think there we have quite some challenges for the future to deal with, but the result as such was more or less expected.
Yusuf, what has driven this move towards the right and indeed in some cases the far right?
I think there's many issues that have created a rise in popularity of the far right. First and foremost being the migration issue. Migration, a huge problem throughout Europe, especially Mediterranean countries when we look at Greece, Italy, France, Spain to an extent as well. And that has created some far-right tendencies, populist rhetoric that has resonated with voters. There's also concerns that the regulatory authority of the European Union over member states is overreaching, and this has played into the hands of far-right politicians as well, as they have talked about this constantly during rallies. Cost of living crisis in many countries, that has also resulted in the rise in popularity. And I think war in Ukraine as well, there's been a heavy burden on European taxpayers, and the far right has used this to say that a diplomatic track is also needed alongside the military support given to Ukraine. So these four major issues have been the bedrock of what far-right parties have campaigned on.
Beatriz, many of the main traditional political parties have had a bloody nose over this past week. Do you think there was a backlash against them because of cost of living and migration, that a lot of EU citizens were just deeply unhappy?
I think what we see is something that we have seen before in the European elections, and it's that the political parties that are in government in the different countries usually take a hit in the European elections. The only exception is Italy, which is a far-right political party on the grow, or Spain, where the socialists have not done so bad after what the polls projected. But indeed, we see that there is a significant hit, particularly on the Liberals and also the Greens, that were part of a number of coalitions in Europe, but also were at the head of certain governments, like the case in France, where we have seen Emmanuel Macron calling for an election. So to some extent, what we see is that the center, right and left, so when we look at the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, they have managed to stay more or less with the same seats. So their hit on them is not so big. But however, when we look at the Liberals and the Greens, it is significant. And I think this is a reflection, first of all, on the backlash against some green policies in a number of countries, particularly Germany, but also a reflection, as our colleagues were saying, about the cost of living crisis and how people interpret that and how they are voting as a punishment against the government that they feel they're not doing enough to protect them.
Here, the makeup of the European Parliament will now be different. There will be new MEPs coming in with new ideas, many of them from the right and the far right. Talk to me about foreign policy. What does this mean for the European Union for the next 5 years?
Well, I think we will have a more fragmented European Union, and that is really worrying because we will have a less geopolitical type of role. And as you know, Ursula von der Leyen was always pushing the geopolitical role of the European Union, Europe that should not only be a soft power, but also a hard power. I think all this will be more difficult to achieve because Europe will be divided, it will be more fragmented, and we will have a lot of challenges on a number of global issues. First of all, migration, of course. The migration issue was definitely a major issue during the elections. We've seen that the extreme right has won in those countries that are most affected by the migration issue. So countries like Austria, countries like Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, they all had a strong extreme right anti-migration policy that was pushed forward. And this will also be reflected in the way we will strike migration deals with some of the countries of North Africa. And you know that some of these deals are not necessarily deals that fully respect the values agendas of the European Union. So I think that the value agenda that Europe is always putting high on its agenda will be affected. Human rights, democracy, support to anti-corruption measures, all this will be put into question by the extreme right, and the European Union will have difficulties to deal with this. Second, in addition to migration, we will have shifts also in relation to development cooperation. We had already a number of European member states that were announcing that they would reduce their budgets for development. I think this will be continued in the next years to come at the individual country level, but also at the European level. We will have difficulties to push Green Deal and other agendas forward.
Yusuf, the far-right groups, while celebrating this week, many of them don't like each other, fragmented, they don't get on. Can they work together?
Well, that's definitely been the weak point of the far right in the past, that they haven't been able to work together, and that happens to be the case when you have nationalistic parties. Can they work together? I think this time around they have a little more experience in European Parliament. When we look at the issues that bring them together, there's more of a spectrum for them to be able to reach an agreement on core issues, as I stated before: migration, cost of living crisis, the power of EU's regulatory authority over member states, war in Ukraine. We can add agriculture into that as well, farmers, because many of these far-right politicians come from rural areas. So they understand the plight the farmers are facing throughout the EU. So I think this time around there's more of a chance that they can get together. But again, the big problem is the nationalism that divides them. So it's probably going to be a little more unity, but it won't be the unity that you would see from the parties in the center or the left.
Beatriz, this has been a seismic result in many countries. Talk to me about France and what has gone on there, because Marine Le Pen must be absolutely rejoicing getting 32% of the vote.
Absolutely. What we have seen with the rise of the far right is a significant rise of two political parties, one in France and another one in Germany. This is very significant because we're talking about two of the founding members of the European Union. In the case of Germany, it's not going to have a short-term impact on the ruling government, but in the case of France, we have seen Emmanuel Macron calling for an election. And this, I think it was an interesting move on the side of Macron, because he saw that that vote was a way of French citizens to show that they were upset with the government, that they were not happy with their policies, and he has taken that hit. He has admitted that there is some criticism, and he's going into an election to put his government on the table and allow people to decide what they want to do. Now, it is very risky, because what we have seen is a significant increase of the representation of the far right, driven not only by Marine Le Pen, but also Jean Bardella, who has become a figure in European politics and in French politics, driving a lot of voters. So we're going to see how that plays out. In my opinion, he has played what I call a Sanchez. If we think about what happened last year after the regional and local elections in Spain, where we saw a significant rise of the right, but also of the far right, what the socialist government did was like, okay, we're going to call for a general election, we're going to put our government on the table, and citizens are going to decide. And they turned the narrative into a decision between whether we want to have a far right and right government, or whether we're going to preserve democracy. So I think it's a little bit what Macron is doing right now. Now the question is if it's going to work.
Geert, just on that point, this is a major gamble by Emmanuel Macron, isn't it? He's saying to the French people, is this really truly what you want?
I think he's taking an enormous risk at this very moment because Marine Le Pen has proven that she can mobilize indeed more than 30% of the electorate. And if we are moving towards the next stages in French politics, including presidential elections in a few years to come, she definitely would be able at a certain point to get to the presidency position. So we are in a situation that he's taking a big gamble. Yeah.
Yusuf, all eyes now on France going forward. A poll in a couple of weeks and then another one on July the 7th. Do you think Macron has done enough to see off the far right, or is this now a battle for the soul of France?
Well, when we look at Macron's decision for snap elections, I don't think he had any other choice. I mean, when you look at the results from the European parliamentary elections, he had to renew confidence in Parliament because you see his popularity waning very fast. And if he did not take this step, it wasn't even a choice. I think it was forced upon him. He had to do this because he would be a lame duck president over the next 3 years, I believe, left in his presidency. So it was a decision he had to make. Now, can he fend off the far right? Well, the far right seems to have a lot of momentum with Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella, but there's also smaller far right parties who have picked up votes as well. So going into it, can Macron solve France's problems, the migration problem, the cost of living problem? Because he's been ruling basically by presidential decree lately. He doesn't really have the support of Parliament, and his decisions have been very unpopular. They have hurt the French economy. They have hurt French companies operating as well. So does he have time? There's only really a month. Does he have time to turn it around? I really don't think so.
Beatriz, just looking ahead to what's going to happen in France, Jordan Bardella has played a blinder on social media, millions of followers on TikTok. Is he likely to jump ahead of Marine Le Pen and get more ambitious now, given all of this electoral success?
What I see is that Marine Le Pen is trying to make it about herself. She has stepped up, and even though the election was led by Jordan Bardella, she's now the one giving interviews, explaining what it's up for Rassemblement National, and I think she's going to try to be back as president as she was before and lead the political party into this national election, because she has been the core candidate of the political party, and I think she's going to try to keep that in mind. However, she needs to capitalize on the popularity that Jordan Bardella has attracted and how he has managed to make this election about the far right at the core of the discussions in France, and also the way that he has done it, creating this sense of the far right as something acceptable and institutionalized, like we have seen in Italy. So I think he has played very well that role, and he has managed to attract a lot of voters.
Geert, there are key players now in European politics, and they're all female. Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, and the position of Ursula von der Leyen. How important is that kind of bond between Meloni and Le Pen if they were to come together in the next few weeks?
Well, I think it's not only about women, it's about, definitely they are two powerful ladies, that's for sure, on the extreme right, but it's more about a variety or a diversity of European member states who all are turning towards the extreme right, with some political parties that have gained a lot, and same goes for countries like Austria, for example. As I said, it is very much migration related, but the worry that we should have is that these new alliances between these or among these extreme right political leadership is that we would have, as European Union, in our foreign policy, more difficulties to keep up our joint positions, for example, vis-à-vis Russia. We know that some of these extreme right parties sometimes sympathize with Russia. They also sympathize sometimes with China. We've seen this in a variety of countries. And this is a very worrying trend that could also affect Europe's measures and efforts that it is taking to better control cybersecurity, to better avoid hate speech, to protect people against all types of interference. And this is absolutely now, at this moment, not guaranteed that this won't continue. I think we should be very worried that those who sympathize with the enemies of the European Union, both political enemies and economic enemies, are at this moment definitely going to play a role, and they will be approached also by these countries in undertaking all types of efforts to undermine this European solidarity. So we are very worried in that respect.
Is that a concern, Yusuf, that the European Union now has this kind of bedrock of people inside it who don't seem to be very pro-European?
It has grown with this election, but I think the core of Europe is still kind of in the center. I mean, at the end of the day, the EPP was able to increase their presence inside Parliament, which is very, very important. When we look at the rest of the spectrum of the right, with ECR a little further to the right and ID even further to the right, they were all also able to increase their presence, but not as much as EPP. I think it's going to be the European Commission president election, or that process of negotiating, will be very, very telling to see how pro-Europe the European Union and EPR, or have they really shifted now to something new?
Beatriz, Ursula von der Leyen scraped in last time by, 9 votes to be president? She needs 361 to be sure of ruling for the next 5 years. What's your prediction? Do you think she can do it again?
I think she can do it again. So first of all, we have to keep in mind that the EPP grew in number of seats, and also that the Social Democrats stay stable. And even if the Liberals have taken a hit, they are still significant in the European Parliament, and all the 3 political parties together, they have enough numbers to make Ursula von der Leyen president again. However, as you said, those numbers are relatively short, and it happened already in the past that she lost some of the support in that election, because in the end that vote is secret, and therefore some MEPs that might not be so comfortable with her might decide to vote against. That's why it's so important, the negotiation that we're going to see in the next few weeks. But I think the particularity of the parliament is that it's not a governing majority versus an opposition. You can make Ursula von der Leyen president, and then on every legislation vote differently. So what we need to see is really a commitment of a number of MEPs to elect Ursula von der Leyen as president of the European Commission, and then we will see how that plays out for her program. But for that to happen, first, she needs to be nominated by the European Council. And here I think that the weight that the EPP has right now is sufficient to secure her nomination despite the growth of the far right.
Geert, talk to me about Belgium, because there seems to be growing discontent about even Belgium existing. You've got these Flanders nationalists, Vlaams Belang, they're growing in their vote. Your Prime Minister had to step down the other day, polling, 7.5%?
Yeah, he didn't step down. He's still in running affairs, but his party lost spectacularly. I think it only got something like 7.5%. So it means that the crow is finished and that his party won't be part of a next coalition. What surprised most observers was that the extreme right Flemish Nationalist Party did not obtain the first place in the elections. So everyone expected them to get more than 25%, and they got something like 21, 22%, which is still a lot, but it is less than the more moderate Flemish nationalist NVA, who do not want to split the country. They want more a stronger confederal state, and they do not want to split the country. So having said that, of course, we have a strong Flemish nationalist group of electorate, almost 45%, in some places even 50%, which is a lot. But you have to make the distinction between the extreme right and the more moderate center-right Flemish nationalists who have taken part in these elections. And it is clear that they will have to make a deal with the francophone part of the country.
Yusuf, talk to me about policy on Ukrainian support and Russia's war in Ukraine. What's the new makeup of the EU Parliament going to spell for that?
Well, I mean, as we talked about during this conversation, these far-right parties are much more sympathetic towards Russia. Is that enough to push the needle inside European Parliament? If Ursula von der Leyen is re-elected as European Commission President, I think that there'll still be very robust support for Ukraine. But I do feel that the far-right parties, especially as groups ECR and ID, and the non-affiliated far-right MEPs as well. Let's not forget there's a very significant number of non-affiliated far-right MEPs. I do think that they are going to try to force the European Union's hand to at least take a more credible diplomatic track as well to trying to end the war, because at the end of the day, the European taxpayer really has shouldered much of the bill, especially with the possibility in November of U.S. Elections ending with Donald Trump coming. So if Donald Trump does come and the U.S. does begin to end its financial support and the European Union is left all by itself shouldering the bill for Ukraine, I do think that we will see more diplomatic initiatives with that far right pushing on European Commission and through Parliament.
Beatriz, you mentioned Pedro Sanchez earlier on in your country, in Spain. What have we seen this week develop in Spanish politics? What have the results told you about the thinking of the Spanish electorate?
Let me first take a little bit on what Yusuf just said, because I think it's important to remember that the European Parliament doesn't have a competence on foreign policy. And so at the European Council, we still have a majority that's pro-Ukraine. It is true that this election is going to have an impact in the way those issues are perceived and the impact that they might have on European voters. But the Parliament has limited capacity really to influence this. Now, going back to Spain, I think it has been an interesting election, because when we look at what the EPP did, it was trying to focus everything on national issues, on national politics, and making this whole election a referendum on Sanchez's government and his decisions on Catalonia. And if we look at the results, that didn't work, because the EPP won that election, but with a very small margin, and the socialists managed to keep a significant number of seats. What it is interesting, though, is that the far right has risen as well in Spain, and that the left has lost some seats, particularly because they decided to run a split up. But I think there's also something interesting for Spanish politics that can have an impact eventually in European politics, and is that we have seen the rise of a new far-right political party that is showing the fatigue of far-right voters that are not happy with the way the far-right has been acting once in government. And that is the case of just a activist that has been very active on social media, and he attracted almost 1 million voters in Spain. So this is something that has happened in Spain, and it has happened also because of the way the European elections work in the country. But I think it could be a sign of what we can see coming in other European countries if the far right keep on not being able to solve the issues that the people are expecting them to solve.
Geert, a lot of the right-wing politicians, and the far right in particular, they don't like green policies. So the makeup of the new EU Parliament, what do you think that will do for green policy going forward across the 27 member states?
Well, it's a typical example of one of these European agendas where the European Union always has been a forerunner, a leader worldwide. We have this Green Deal that is really very much advanced compared to all other initiatives on greening our economy, making the transformation towards climate policies, which are very, very progressive, you could say. I think all this will be affected, of course, by what is happening in a number of European member states, because if there is one thing next to migration that really offends the more right-wing voter, then it is definitely the measures that are being taken against carbon emissions, less cars on our roads, taxes on airline tickets and these type of things. So there's a lot of people, and definitely also the agricultural sector, and those people who are really also affected by some of the measures taken with the Green Deal, environmental measures and so on. These are the electorates that have shifted from traditional parties to sometimes right-wing and extreme right-wing parties. So I think we will have problems to manage to realize this Green Deal agenda in the next years to come.
Yusuf, I want to talk about migration just going forward briefly. Do you think everything changes now with all these right-wingers coming in and Europe's policy towards migrants?
I don't think everything changes, but I think there's definitely going to be more pressure to find very quick solutions for migration. I think that especially with Marine Le Pen in France and Giorgia Meloni in Italy, the two countries that have probably taken the biggest brunt of irregular migration and illegal migration, with far-right parties securing the top spot in both. I definitely think that migration is going to be put high on the agenda. There's going to be a lot of pressure to find solutions, but I don't think those solutions come from Europe. I think those solutions come from the source of the migration. So Europe needs to play a more active role in Africa and the Middle East if they really want to be serious about stopping irregular migration.
Beatriz, final question to you. Have we ever seen the European Union and its parliament so fragmented?
No, I think this is the first in history, and this is going to have an impact for sure, because as I said before, we might have a governing majority, but then on a case by case, in every legislation, we're going to see different majorities forming. And the difference from what we have seen in the past is that this alternative majority now turns to the right. As just said before, there are a number of new political parties that are not yet affiliated with any group, but they are also going to be very influential. One of them is Fidesz from Hungary, but also AfD from Germany. So I see that there is a number of new political parties that are going to have a lot of impact, that we see a more fragmented European Parliament because we have the Greens is smaller, the Liberals are smaller, and so we're going to see a lot of negotiation on every piece of legislation, and that's going to make a lot more difficult for the EU to legislate, and probably it's going to weaken its soft polity in the world.
Beatriz, Yusuf and Geert, thank you all so much for your expert insight on this roundtable. And you can see more debate and discussion on our YouTube channel. Just search for TRT World Roundtable. From me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here in quite a blustery Brussels. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.